Well, good morning, and welcome to another week of Journey with Christ. I'm your host, Mark Mitchell, a preaching minister at the Park Avenue Church of Christ. I'm joined, as usual, by Steve Fox, a preacher for over 50 years. Well, how are you doing today?
I'm doing okay. I started when I was 5.
Yeah.
You didn't know that?
Well,
I started when I was 5.
well, then I need to change my introduction.
I'm doing fine.
Good.
I want to start this morning by sharing something with the entire group that I'm not smart enough to come up with something like this, but one of the ministers on TV last week, I was flipping around and watched one of the ministers on television, and he mentioned that we should all be like the Apostle Paul. And I thought, well, where's he going with this? No, we should all be like the Apostle Paul. And he said, we all need to be on the road to Damascus. So now, every day when you get up in the morning, you will pray that God will Damascus.
Yeah.
I hope it's getting close.
I do too.
Of course, I don't think it's all that much of a difficulty. I hear people say, well, it's so uncomfortable. The masks are so uncomfortable. Let them hook you up to a respirator and see how comfortable you are.
Yeah. Lie still, can't move, oxygen tents all around you, and yeah. But I'm with you on this. Whether we're as close as I want us to be, or maybe in my mind I think we are, we're still closer than we were.
Oh, yeah.
And with spring spring is just making a huge difference as far as the attitude of people. I mean, you go through any place right now, people are in better moods. They are in better moods. And it is very heartwarming to me for people to realize, to come to a place where they're not complaining.
Well, if this has taught us anything, it's taught us a little bit about patience. And I feel so sorry for the people who have lost family members in this epidemic, because it's on TV all the time, it's on the radio all the time, it's half of the newspaper. You are constantly reminded of the fact that you lost somebody dear to you.
Yeah. Well, like you say, I'm ready to get close.
That's right.
Well, last week we ended up in Revelation chapter 20, and I thought we would cover the last two verses, because they have a context here that there is a little bit of confusion of various things. But I'm going to begin reading in verse 11 down through 15. Then I saw a great white throne, and him who was seated on it. The earth and the heavens fled from his presence, and there was no place for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and the books were opened. Another book was opened, which is the book of life. The dead were judged according to what they had done, as recorded in the books. The sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them. And each person was judged according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. The lake of fire is the second death, and anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. There are many things that I think that are written in the New Testament up through the book to the book of Revelations, and maybe even all the way up to the book of Revelation 20, that you could say, okay, I'm not really sure about some of this stuff. Is there are these people still here, either getting a second chance, because there's some people like to think of that theology, or are there some people there who are suffering continuously? This 2 verses is pretty adamant, and it's one of the only times in Revelation where it's kind of like, this is it.
It's cut and dried.
This is cut and dry.
Yeah.
Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. Okay, we know what that is. The lake of fire is the second death. Now, I know that some people use the theological definition of death as being separation from God, but it's almost as in this context, it was one period ended, and it looks to me, it seems as if another period is ending.
We noticed one verse last week that talked about the beast and the false prophet being thrown into the lake of fire, and it says they will
Suffer.
They will suffer. What's the word that's used? They will suffer forever and ever. In other words, they would have no control over that. The pain. And if you've ever stuck your hand in a fire, and then you think about God doing that to somebody forever, and they can never get out of it. I'd like to kind of drive a stake in the ground right here and just stay here for a minute, because John wrote it first, but you brought it up. Death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And then in the next verse it says, if your name was not found in the book of life, which we're going to talk about in a minute, then they were thrown in the lake of fire as well. When was the last, well, let me start over. When was the last time you heard a really good sermon about hell? I mean, we're afraid of it, and we want to stay away from it. We don't like the topic, we don't like the idea, and who would?
No.
Because read the definition here. What's happening in that lake of fire? I don't want to have anything to do with it, and you don't either.
We've come to the point now we don't like anything about judgment.
Oh.
Period.
You're reading my notes, aren't you?
That's right.
You've been reading my notes.
I'm sorry.
We don't want judged about anything. We want to do. If I want to do it, I ought to have the right to do it.
Yeah, we've Americanized our theology, and
instead of the other way around.
Instead of the other way around.
Well, you can cut out all the verses in the Bible you want to about hell.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, if this book has any authority, and we believe it does,
yep.
You can cut the word Bible, you can cut the word hell out of the Bible, but it's still not going to make it unreal.
No.
And you can argue all you want to about the reality of the reality of hell is in the book. It's
right.
There. Jesus addressed it. It's really interesting to me to note that in Paul's either 13 or 14 epistles, however many he wrote, he does not mention the word hell one time, because his audience was almost always Gentile, and they didn't have a concept of Hades or Gehenna or hell like the Jews did.
Yep.
So you can't really argue about the reality of hell, but you can argue about the reality. You can argue about the nature of hell. So, in the next couple minutes, and I should have given you a list of these. In the next couple minutes, what does Revelation 20 say about what's going to happen to the wicked? Well, there are all kinds of New Testament scriptures, and I'm to be truthful with you, 35 years ago, I was having a discussion with a guy, and he told me about a couple verses that had really bothered him, and he did his own study, recommended a book, and I said, you're out of your mind. And the more I read it, and the more I studied it, after a while, I just gave up. I just threw up the white flag and started waving the white flag and said, I surrender. I'm not going to argue.
Edward Fudge messed you up, didn't he?
Yes, it was a book called, I did get to meet him one time. He's dead now. So he knows more answers than I do.
Yeah,
I guarantee you. But
what a book he could write now.
Oh, no kidding. No kidding.
And that's not even saying how good the first book was, too.
And here's the list. This is from his book and other books as well. What's going to happen to the wicked? They will perish. They will be consumed. They will be destroyed. They will lose their life. They will die, which is the second death. Mm-hmm. They are cast into the lake of fire, which is the second death. And if you read that list, this is not a cartoon. This is not something funny about hell.
No.
It's a real thing. It's something that we will have to face one of these days.
Yeah.
So, if you go back and look at that list, this is what we teach. They will not perish. They will not be consumed. They will not be destroyed. They will not lose their life. They will not die. And they will not go through the lake of fire.
Yeah.
I mean, we take all those words and make them exactly the opposite of the way the Bible uses it.
You know, it's almost as if we think pain and suffering is worse than non-existence. But I think in all actuality, given, I mean, you can ask people on their deathbed, you know, there are some people, even in their pain and suffering, still don't want to die. They still don't want it to end. Ending means it's over completely. And in my estimation, as I feel right now, I mean, I'd have to go through a lot of pain and suffering to me get to the point that said, okay, excuse me, I'd rather have death. I don't want to be here anymore. But there's going to be that I'm going to have to get there, because it's not going to be my first reaction.
No. And if you stop and think about the human nature behind that, you know, I had 3 kids, and every once in a while they did not do what they were supposed to be doing.
Really?
So
took it after Susie. Huh?
If I put one of those kids in a room and I took a stick, you know, a sharp stick, and every morning I go in there and just jab them, just keep jabbing them for an hour. And then the next day you go in there and you do that forever and ever and ever, and that kid can't get out of that environment, he can't get out of that situation. I hope somebody would say, Fox, you're a lousy father. You're an awful father. But that's what we say God will do to people who are wicked. They will burn in the lake of fire and
forever.
Not be consumed, and they will be. Now, what you're going to have to do is, if this is all new to some people in our audience, look at the verses.
Yeah.
And I'll be the first to admit there are 4 verses that I don't know what to do with. It makes it sound like it's eternal punishment, and that they will be punished forever and can't get out of it. But there are scores of verses that say something else. Yeah, that it ends.
Well, we do have reference and various things, especially at the first part of the book of Revelation 20, where John writes that Satan now, his is endless.
Mm-hmm.
He is. But he is from a different reality.
Satan and the false prophet.
Satan and the false prophet. Yeah. And I'm going to venture to say that Satan and his army will be in there too. Those who knew God as angels are going to be held to a higher standard than you and I.
Sure.
And so...
Well, it certainly has to be important to John, because in 20 verse 6, 20 verse 10, 20, and 20 verses 14 and 15, it talks about the lake of fire.
Yeah.
And every time it says lake of fire, it says this is the second death. Yeah. So we understand what physical death is. We understand what it is to die the first time. John says there is something known as the second death.
And he
where the soul of man and the spirit of man is destroyed, just like the human body will be destroyed.
Yeah, and you know, like you said, you were looking want to go for that word. They were tormented day and night.
Thank you. That's the word. I couldn't think of torment.
Day and night forever. And then it comes down there, and the other one, it says, "And the lake of fire is the second death." I mean, it is as if there is a distinction here, though. As you said earlier, there are a few verses in the New Testament before Revelation 20 where there are some ambiguities that create a little bit. And I'm not saying, please understand that this is all the way it is, because nobody on this side knows for sure.
Exactly.
We'll find out.
What I finally did, and I said a little while ago about waving this white flag and just surrendering, to me it became what you hear in court all the time, a preponderance of the evidence. And here were 4 verses that kind of made it seem that way, and you could take those 4 verses and preach a sermon about it and say people are going to be tormented forever. And then there are scores of other verses that talk about perishing and dying and being consumed and thrown in the lake of fire. So for me, it was a preponderance of the evidence. There's a whole lot more on this side than there is on this side.
Exactly. And to say that there won't be some that there may be circumstances that we're not because we're not God. We do not have all that information and insight. There may be elements of individuals who torment forever is what's going to happen to them.
And I am sure that if you write on a piece of paper the name of Adolf Hitler, and you write down my grandmother's name on my mom's side, I'm sure that if God,
there's a difference.
If neither one of them are going to be saved, one of them's going to have a whole lot more punishment and torment than the other one. And that's why God makes the calls.
And there's definitely evidence in the Bible that says that those who are good, there are some whose crown's a little bit bigger than other people's. So evidently there can be the possibility that their torment is different from one another too. So.
And Jesus talked about people who were beaten with few stripes and many stripes.
That's right. So
it's everybody. Everybody doesn't get exactly the same punishment.
Well, the beauty,
they get the punishment they deserve.
And the beauty of it is, it says they were judged according to their deeds. So evidently, deeds has a cumulative effect. So it's all. I think all Steve and I are saying is this stuff is not as clear cut and black and white as we grew up thinking that it was. You're either in or out. It's more complicated than that.
Yes.
So
there are all kinds of different stages, and God is in charge of those stages.
Yeah, and he leaves things in there that if you want to look at them, say, hey, this is not as simple, and they're going to look at all their deeds. So
we stopped last week talking about the lake of fire, and we were discussing the word 1,000, and my mind went blank last week, as it normally does in the past few years, and I couldn't think of that verse. It said the Lamb's Book of Life, but that's in 21, so we will get there eventually.
Yes.
It's in chapter 21 where it's called the Lamb's Book of Life.
Would you like to read the first 8 verses of Revelation 21?
Okay. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth have passed away, and there is no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city. Man, this is the whole book right here.
Yep.
And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is among men, and he shall dwell among them, and they shall be his peoples, and God himself shall be among them. And he shall wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no longer any death. Why is there no longer any death? Death got thrown in the lake of fire.
That's right.
There shall be no longer any death. There shall be no longer any mourning or crying or pain, for the first things have passed away. And he who sits on the throne said, Behold, I'm making all things new. And he said, Write, for these words are faithful and true. And he said to me, It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will give to him who thirsts from the spring of water of life without cost. And he who overcomes shall inherit these things, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. But for the cowardly and the unbelieving and the abominable and the murderers and immoral persons and sorcerers and idolaters and all liars, their part will be in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death.
Yeah. There is a huge amount of discussions on that first part, new heaven, new earth. And in fact, I've actually heard some discussions of, Peter talks about this world here will burn up. But then there's also Romans characteristics that this world is waiting in anticipation to be reborn itself. So there's a little bit, for those who think this thing's all, again, one of those moments where it's all settled, there is some dissension in what's going on. Does this new heaven, new earth, because the first one had passed away, I mean, you could possibly take the illustration of baptism, what that means. When you and I, as physical bodies, die, we pass into water, we're put in, and what do we come up as? New creatures.
New creature.
So, does that could that be what that means? Or does it mean, like Peter says, it's all burned up and it's all thrown in and destroyed, and then there's a new heaven, new earth? I'm not really sure. And to be honest with you, it doesn't really matter, I think, in the big scheme of things. But I have heard, and this is the only reason I bring up this discussion, I have heard some Christians whose attitude is, we can do whatever we want to this earth because it's going to be burnt up. That is not the proper attitude.
No, not at all. Before we go to the first part of that chapter that I just read, there's a couple things I wanted to say that we kind of left open last week. Didn't get the bow tied on the package as tight as we'd like to. The word 1,000 is in the book of Revelation 30 times.
Wow.
30 times. And you have to figure out as you're reading every individual verse where it mentions the 1,000, is that literal or is that a symbol of something? If it's literal, maybe there are going to be Christians and people who have been beheaded and raised again, which is the first resurrection. Maybe there are going to be people that take care of everything, and those people are said to reign on the earth for 1,000 years. So is that on the new earth, or is that in the old heaven and earth, or is the new heaven and earth going to pass away? And then that brings us to chapter 21. Have you noticed when we were reading that Satan's always getting cast somewhere? He got cast out of heaven, he got cast into the bottomless pit, and then he ends up getting cast in a lake of fire. He's getting cast around, moved around a lot because of exactly what he deserves. The last two verses in chapter 20 talk about these books, a book of life and the book of the Lamb's book of life. Both of those references are taken from Daniel 7 and Daniel 12, where Daniel talks about the books that were opened.
Yeah.
And you and I were talking last week about what it would be like to have your name written on that list. Mm-hmm. My grandson went out for the basketball team at George Washington, and he was telling me about how your pulse goes, your pulse starts racing and you get a little nervous when you go over there after every practice and look up there on that wall, see if your name's up there.
See if you made the team or not.
See if you made the team or not.
Yep.
And just imagine thinking about the Lamb's Book of Life, wanting to have your name in there. You mentioned a little while ago we don't like judgment. Boy, that's true. People get really, really upset when, the Apostle Paul said to a couple churches that he wrote to, "Am I your enemy because I tell you the truth?"
Yeah.
I mean, am I opposed to you and your lifestyle because I'm telling you what's actually true and accurate?
1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians both deal with, okay, one of them felt like it was too hard, and the second one was like, okay, so you want an apology from me or what?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I didn't know the answer to this, so I went back and looked at it. Jesus told 50 parables during his ministry, and 25 of them were about judgment. Do you think that maybe that kind of leans us in the direction of thinking that Jesus was concerned about judgment and what's going to happen to those people who either get to go in this New Jerusalem, which we'll talk about in just a minute, or are thrown in the lake of fire? Do you think Jesus is concerned about that? Sure he is.
Well, you could make the case, and reading the scriptures, that Jesus' interest in judgment was in our judgment before God, and a lot of times he talked about in our judgment as we judge one another. That's the only judgment we're interested in, is like I get to stand up here and decide who's right, who's wrong. That I'm not entitled to any of that judgment. I mean, I can see for myself as the book of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, many of the books that deal with thoughts of wisdom, says, you can stand back and pay attention and recognize, hey, that's not what anybody should do. But nobody sent me to go over into them and condemn them and tell them, I should maybe help them.
Well, I'll tell you where we've gotten in our society. We despise judgment so much that if I went out and walked into a restaurant and shot somebody in cold blood, and then they arrested me, I could say, well, Jesus said you're not supposed to judge. Thou shalt not judge.
You can't judge me.
Well, that's where we've gotten in our society.
Yep.
The logic is just plain gone.
Yeah, it's sideways.
Yeah.
It's sideways.
Would you read the first 2 verses again of chapter 21? And I'm going to ask you to look for something in these 2 verses.
Okay. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband.
Now, I'm going to ask you in our audience and me to reconsider this. What have you heard all your life about the New Jerusalem? We were, Susie and I were visiting one time, this is 15 years ago, 20 years ago. We were visiting at a church, and they were talking about the first paragraph in Revelation 21. Mm-hmm. And the guy who was the teacher, who was a very good teacher, really interesting class, he said, now, as we all know, the new heaven and new earth is heaven. And Susie went, like, keep your mouth shut. We don't know these people. We are visiting. We're going to be here. Go to class, go to church, and get in the car and leave. Now, Don't start anything.
Don't make it where they remember who you are.
Yeah. I remember that idiot that was in class one time. I bit my tongue, bit my lip, and she was so proud of me. Now, I missed this for so long, and it's so simple. It is just so simple. Almost everybody I ever met says, well, that's heaven. The new heaven and new earth, that's heaven. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth passed away, and there's no more sea. I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. The New Jerusalem is not heaven because it comes down out of heaven. And then he
resides someplace else.
It resides someplace else. And then he says, and you know that because this New Jerusalem comes down out of heaven. And so if it's coming down out of heaven, what does it hit? It has to hit the earth somewhere.
Yeah.
Oh, there's nothing else for it. So this and now, I just missed this for so long because New Jerusalem is what it means. New Jerusalem is not New Hampshire. It's not New York.
Yeah.
It's not New Mexico.
It's a new version of something.
It's not New England. And it's also not New Rome, even though a lot of people want this whole book to end up being Rome with having a new Rome. That's not how it ends.
And taking that interpretive language, being as he used the word Jerusalem and New Jerusalem, I think you could also take with it this descriptive term, which I think is a hint of what New Jerusalem is when he talks about it being a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. In essence, that's the church. The church is the New Jerusalem.
And she's as beautiful as she can be.
That's right.
Just like a bride.
Because in God's, we put a lot of emphasis on physical realities. How much does God put emphasis on physical realities? Not as much as we do. Mm-hmm. So, this New Jerusalem, though maybe streets and things of that nature, it's actually representative of something more than it is real.
Yes.
Not to say that it's still not real, but it's real in a way that God perceives what's real.
And he reinforces that reality by saying the tabernacle of God is with men. It's not men going the other direction to the tabernacle of God. It's the tabernacle of God coming out of heaven in this New Jerusalem and coming to this planet where people are a part of that.
That's right.
It's just, when you read New Jerusalem, it's a beautiful phrase.
Oh.
I mean,
it's one of those phrases that, like, hey, we're going to Hawaii.
Yeah.
Hey! Well, New Jerusalem.
When are we doing that? I must have missed that part.
No, we're not. You and I are not going to Hawaii.
We're not even going to the new Hawaii.
No,
probably not. Well, those first two verses are so important because you see the holy city coming down out of heaven. It's not heaven. It comes down out of heaven, and God's tabernacle. God tabernacles.
That's right.
It's used as a verb with men.
Well, and you even given, I don't know, the other part of that verse. Look, God's dwelling place is where? Now among the people.
Yeah.
And where does God dwell now? In heaven.
But what you said about the physical part and the spiritual part, he reigns everywhere.
Right. Well, yeah, you're right. God's in thing
go
and
where
everything.
He's not.
That's right.
Yeah.
You can. But the context here kind of makes it an emphasis toward, okay, this is it's going to be.
Yes.
There is a time where this is how it is, and which makes it different than what we're having now. Now that part, how that happens, I don't know.
And what we studied so far in this chapter and in the chapters before this, there were several things of human origin, like the sea beast and the land beast and the false prophet. Those originate with human beings who have decided to listen to their own voices. Yes, and listen to the voices of other people who don't know what in the world's going on in this world.
Right.
So that's the human origin of all these things. The divine origin is the New Jerusalem.
That's right. And it I don't think words can accurately describe or define it, but we all recognize the feeling of what it means. Mm-hmm. I mean, it actually gives every ounce of power that hope has to it. This new idea of something that is perfect, utopia to us, where people are kind and loving toward one another, where God's presence is everywhere, where flowers bloom and trees blossom, and
you don't have to lock your door.
And life is lived the way God intended it to be.
And what did you say a little while ago, or was that last week? Thy will be done
on earth
as it is in heaven.
And this is a place where that happens. Mm-hmm. This is a place.
Now there's also another extension of that, because in this New Jerusalem he says God will wipe away, and I've heard this read at funerals lots of times, and it's very appropriate. He shall wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall no longer be any death, because death got thrown in the lake of fire.
That's right.
There shall be no longer any mourning or crying or pain. The first things have been passed away. All this comes true. The fact of this comes true by these people getting to live in the New Jerusalem, which was so much different than the old Jerusalem and old Rome and old Alexandria. Every city you can name.
And as Jesus will say, I am making everything new. Mm-hmm. Which is, in essence, that center section that we talked about a little earlier of Romans 8, where everything will be made new. How that happens, again, like when baptism, when we come out of water, we're new.
Yeah.
Even though we can't see new, we look like we're the same bunch, we're just wet. That's all we see. But in God's economy, We are new.
When that happens, there are all kinds of things going on in the spiritual world that we can't see with our
That's right.
physical eyes.
So a lot of this stuff, and to me, this is our day. This is where we create a tremendous amount of misunderstandings. If we take spiritual truths and try to place them to physical realities, you're making a mess.
Mark, were you ever lucky enough to buy a brand new car?
Once.
One time?
No, twice.
Twice?
Yeah.
When you go to the dealership and they're showing you around and you're looking at different cars, and you open up the door and you just go in and shut the door, and you smell that. And 2 days later, after you bought it, it doesn't smell like that anymore.
Listen.
He made all things new. When I read this, He made all things new, I think about sitting in a brand new car. That smell is just absolutely marvelous.
Can you imagine what our senses are dull to right now?
Yeah.
I mean, so there is to me, maybe we lose sometimes in our efforts to take these wonderful elements and make them physical. We miss some of the grandeur that's about to happen in this moment. Because, okay, like your explanation of New Jerusalem, I mean, this is something that is amazing, and evidently it's really, really cool, but we want to make it like, okay, that New Jerusalem is just like the one over here.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Why would God want to make something that was pristine and turn it into this?
I had 8 hours of Greek
I'm sorry.
I know a little Greek. He owns a delicatessen in South Charleston. I had 8 hours of Greek in college and hated every minute of it. I got behind, and when you get behind in a language, it's
impossible.
Especially a language that has a different alphabet than what you're used to.
Oh, yeah.
And that alphabet is mentioned here, where God says, it's done. I am the Alpha and the Omega. We would say the A and Z, the first letter of the alphabet and the last letter of the alphabet.
From A to Z.
From A to Z, from the beginning and the end. I will give to the one who thirsts from the spring of water, the water of life without cost. There's that new smell again.
And that new reality.
Yeah.
Without cost. Why? Because it's already been paid for.
Mm-hmm.
It's a continuation on this understanding of our faith, and he goes into it down here and clarifies this faith, what this faith looks like. But it's perpetuated all the way. To the thirsty I will give water without cost from the spring of the water of life. Evidently meaning that there is an element that maybe.
It's one of the greatest things in the world, pure water.
Well, and the refreshing thing of someone who's thirsty. Of course, now I know this is not speaking physically. This is speaking spiritually of those who maybe are broken, who've shown up, who maybe like the martyrs and who watched family die in horrid fashions and things of that nature. There is something that made available to them that makes the difference.
And speaking of family, maybe this would be a good place to start next week, where it talks about my family. The cowardly, the unbelieving, the abominable, the murderers and immoral persons, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars. I don't know where in the world somebody was doing some researching and found a whole...
Yeah,
that's scary. That whole verse right there, when you read it, you go, I don't want to be with them.
Well, it's like a reminder of the list, the deeds that have action. And maybe it's just a small caveat to those whose name is written on the book. If you do these things and your name was written on the book, it might have been pulled out of the book.
Yep.
Okay? So it's just a reminder.
John told some of the churches in the early part of Revelation,
I got some things against you.
Got some things against you, and
If you
here's
keep
what
it
you
up.
should not do. If you do, your candlestick will be taken away from you.
That's right. And if you keep it up, your name will be taken out of the book of life. This is probably a good spot for us to quit because we've got to our thing. So we're going to close off for right now. But because Steve is going to be out of town or not available next week, let's put it that way.
To see grandchildren.
Yes. And so we're going to go ahead and record the second half of this edition. So on behalf of Steve and I, we're so glad you joined us this week. And we're going to continue on recording so we can have some more for next week. So, see you next week.